White 46. That's the only marking left on the rudder. A red lightning bolt. White borders, the number painted underneath in a hand that was clearly rushed. Clark Field, Luzon, January 31st, 1945. The Japanese had run. They didn't have time to burn this one. The fighter sits alone on the strip, nose up, propeller still, one chunk missing from the left wing's leading edge where something clipped it during the retreat. American ground crews walk toward it the way you walk towards something you've only seen in silhouette. At 300 yards, in a gun camera film, going the other direction. This is the first time anyone on the Allied side has stood next to an intact Nakajima Ki-84. They already have a name for it, Frank. And Frank has a reputation. Pilots who fought it over Leyte and Luzon come back describing something that climbs like nothing they've flown against, turns inside their formations, and disappears before they can call it in. What they don't know yet, what the engineers standing on this runway are about to find out, is that the aircraft in front of them was never supposed to fly this well. Its own factory couldn't build it to the standard its designers signed off on. And the proof of that is sitting in the metal skin, in plain sight, waiting for someone to run a hand along it. The unit responsible is TAIU-SWPA, the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, Southwest Pacific Area. Their job isn't combat, it's autopsy. They take captured enemy aircraft apart, piece by piece, and turn what they find into intelligence that changes how the war gets fought. They've already worked over a Raiden interceptor, a Judy dive bomber, a Betty bomber pulled from the same stretch of abandoned airfield. The Ki-84 is next, and it's the one they've been waiting for. Before anyone touches a panel, they walk it. Nose to tail, slow, in silence. One technical officer runs his palm along the top of the wing and stops. He doesn't say anything yet, he just stops. The first thing they measure is the outline, because outline tells you what a designer wanted. This is a low-wing monoplane, all metal fuselage, fabric only on the control surfaces, ailerons, elevator, rudder. Two synchronized 12.7mm machine guns in the nose, cannon in the wings on later production models. Compact. Nothing wasted. The kind of shape that tells you the man who drew it was chasing speed and climb above everything else. They get the aircraft onto a scale. Empty weight comes in under 6,000 pounds. Light for a fighter carrying this much firepower and this large an engine. A P-51D empty is closer to 7,000. The Ki-84 is doing more with less, and every engineer on that strip understands immediately what that means for a dogfight. Less mass to throw around, less mass to slow it down in a climb. One of the fitters, a sergeant who spent 3 years pulling Merlins and Allisons apart, just shakes his head and writes "damn light" in the margin of his notebook. Nobody corrects him. The next stage of the examination starts under the cowling. They pull the panels off the nose and find the Nakajima Ha-45, the engine called Homar, Honor. 18 cylinders, 2 rows of 9, air-cooled, rated at nearly 2,000 horsepower with water injection on takeoff. On paper, this is one of the most powerful radial engines Japan ever put into a single-seat fighter. But it's not a simple engine. It runs on direct fuel injection instead of a carburetor. More efficient, more resistant to cutting out under negative G maneuvers, and considerably harder to build correctly. It needs tight tolerances, skilled hands, and consistent materials. The engineers open the accessory section and start finding variation. A fitting torqued slightly differently than its neighbor. A seal that doesn't quite match the factory drawing. Small things. The kind of small things that, alone, mean nothing. The same week TAIU is pulling this engine apart. American B-29s are running incendiary raids against Japanese aircraft plants on Honshu. The two events are connected in a way nobody on that runway knows yet. The next layer is where the hands-on work gets serious. They pull the wing skin panels to inspect the spar and the fuel tankage. And this is where the technical officer who stopped and stared back on day one finally speaks up. The aluminum skin is thin, thinner in places than the blueprints captured alongside the aircraft call for. Rivet spacing isn't consistent panel to panel. On some sections, the rivet head sits slightly proud, not quite flush, which on a fighter built for speeds past 400 miles an hour is not a cosmetic issue. It's drag, it's turbulence bleeding off the surface exactly where the designer needed the airflow clean. He runs his thumbnail across a seam near the wing root and it catches, just slightly. He looks up at the sergeant and says, "This wasn't built by the same hands as the engine." What it meant, in plain terms, somebody who understood aerodynamics designed this airframe, and somebody who didn't have the training to execute that design built it. Those are two different Japans. One is the Japan of 1943, when the Ki-84 prototype first flew at Tachikawa, and a test pilot named Lieutenant Funabashi pushed it to 387 miles an hour in level flight. A genuine world-class fighter built by an experienced aviation workforce. The other is the Japan of early 1945, grinding through its fourth year of war, running out of the men who used to build these aircraft to that standard. One of the engineers sits back against the tailwheel, lights a cigarette, and just looks at the aircraft for a while. Somebody hands him tea in a tin cup. It goes cold before he touches it. He's not resting. He's doing the arithmetic in his head. How many of these are out there built exactly like this one, flown by pilots who have no idea their aircraft is quietly working against them? The next stage is getting it airborne. Ground crew rebuild the damaged wing section, service the Hummer engine, and get White 46 into the air over Clark Field under American colors. The aircraft now carrying the designation S-17. From there, it's shipped south to Eagle Farm, near Brisbane, where the Technical Air Intelligence Unit runs full comparative flight trials. Australian and American test pilots fly it in formation against a Royal Navy Supermarine Seafire 3, a Grumman F6F5 Hellcat, and a North American P-51 Mustang. The best fighters the Allies have in the Pacific Theatre, all in the air at once, all next to the aircraft their squadrons had been losing wingmen to for months. The numbers back up what everyone already suspected from combat reports. In the climb, the Ki-84 holds its own against every aircraft in that formation. In level speed, it's competitive. In a turning fight at low altitude, more than one test pilot comes back saying it's the equal of anything they've got. And that's the layer that should be the whole story. A Japanese fighter as good as anything in the Allied inventory. Except the engineers on the ground already know something the pilots in the air don't. This airframe is inconsistent, and inconsistency in an aircraft skin doesn't stay theoretical once you push it hard enough. They take S-17 up for a high-speed dive test, the kind of test built to find the edge of what an airframe can survive. Full throttle, nose down, airspeed climbing past what any Japanese pilot in combat would ever intentionally fly. This is where the earlier finding stops being a paperwork note and becomes something you can watch happen. At speed, ground crew filming the aircraft on its high-speed passes can see it. A faint rippling along sections of the wing skin, a flexing that shouldn't be visible on a properly tensioned aluminum surface. The panels aren't failing. They're not coming apart, but they're moving in a way the designer never intended because the metal underneath them isn't uniform. Thinner here, thicker there, fastened by hands working at a pace, and with a training level the original 1943 production line never had to deal with. One test pilot climbs out afterward, walks straight to the wing, and just puts his flat hand on the panel like he's checking a patient's pulse. He doesn't say a word for almost a full minute. What it meant? The Ki-84 wasn't failing because the Japanese couldn't design a world-class fighter. It was struggling because Japan, by 1945, could no longer consistently build the fighters it had already designed. The munitions ministry had been pulling in civilian labor with no aviation background and putting them straight onto the line. No time for the years of training that precision aircraft work actually requires. Every rippled panel on this airframe is a data point about the collapse of an entire industrial base, and it's sitting right there in the metal for anyone who knows how to read it. At the same moment, TAIU is filming that wing flex over Eagle Farm. American planners in Washington and Guam are building the casualty estimates for an eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands. Every piece of intelligence about Japan's actual industrial capacity, not its propaganda capacity, its real capacity, goes straight into those estimates. Here's the discovery. The engineers didn't just find a flawed aircraft, they found a flawed nation. The Ki-84 in front of them was designed by engineers as good as any in the world. It was flown, in the hands of a skilled pilot, by an aircraft that could outclimb a Mustang, and it was built, in early 1945, by hands that no longer had the training to finish the job the designers had started. The gap between the blueprint and the rivet line was the most honest intelligence report Japan's aircraft industry had ever produced. And it hadn't come from a spy. It came from a wing. The consequence was immediate. TAIU's findings on inconsistent Japanese production quality fed directly into Allied assessments of how much longer Japan could sustain a war in the air. Every captured aircraft after this one got the same treatment. Not just performance testing, but a manufacturing audit, panel by panel, rivet by rivet. Intelligence planners stopped asking only how good a fighter was and started asking how many of them could actually be built to spec. A question that shaped bombing priorities against aircraft plants and shaped how confidently Allied commanders could plan around Japan's dwindling ability to field first-line fighters in the war's final months. For the pilots who'd been losing wingmen to Ki-84s over Luzon, it meant something simpler and more immediate. The aircraft that had terrified them in the air was, on the ground, quietly coming apart at the seams, and every unit that flew it lost a little more of that edge with every month the war dragged on. S-17, the aircraft once marked White 46, was shipped from Australia to the United States and tested further at Wright Field, Ohio, where engineers pushed a late production example, running on high-octane American fuel to 426 miles an hour, nearly 40 faster than that first Tachikawa prototype ever managed back in 1943. It's the number the airframe's own designer wrote into the specification sheet, one it never got to hit consistently in the country that built it, and one it only reached once it was fed fuel and precision Japan itself couldn't spare by the end of the war. That aircraft still exists. After decades in the United States, stored for the Smithsonian, restored, flown for years at the Planes of Fame Museum in Chino, California, it went back to Japan and now sits in the markings of its original unit, the 11th Sentai, at a museum in Kagoshima Prefecture. It's the only Ki-84 left in the world. Visitors walk past the wing every day. Most of them see a fast, dangerous-looking fighter and move on to the next exhibit. Almost none of them run a thumbnail along that skin the way one tired engineer did on a runway in Brisbane in 1945 and feel, underneath the paint, the exact moment an empire ran out of the hands it needed to finish what it started.